September 22, 1980. Iran-Iraq border near the city of Khorramshahr. The morning air over the flat marshlands of southwestern Iran is thick with humidity rising from the Shatt al-Arab waterway. Fishermen along the banks pause as a distant thunder rolls across the horizon. At first, it sounds like a storm moving in from the Persian Gulf. Then the sky fills with aircraft. Iraqi fighter jets streak across the border at low altitude, their engines tearing through the quiet morning. Seconds later, explosions rip across Iranian airfields in cities like Avaz-Dezful and Kermanshah. Runways erupt into fire and smoke. Radar towers collapse. Fuel depots ignite in towering black plumes visible for miles. Across the frontier, Iraqi artillery batteries begin firing in coordinated waves. Shells slam into Iranian border posts, military barracks, and nearby towns. Bridges shatter. Roads disappear beneath dust and shrapnel. Civilians run through streets carrying children and bundles of belongings. A war that will last 8 years has just begun. In Baghdad, the man responsible for this sudden eruption of violence sits inside a heavily guarded presidential compound. Saddam Hussein, president of Iraq and the dominant figure in the Ba'ath Party government, watches intelligence reports arriving from the front. For months, he has prepared for this moment. Across the border, Iran is still reeling from the shockwaves of its own revolution. Just a year earlier, in 1979, the monarchy of Mohammad Reza Shah collapsed after months of mass protests and political upheaval. The country's new leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, returned from exile and established an Islamic republic built on revolutionary ideology. The transformation was dramatic and chaotic. The Iranian military, once one of the strongest in the Middle East, had been purged of hundreds of senior officers suspected of loyalty to the old regime. Command structures were fractured. Equipment maintenance had stalled. Rival revolutionary organizations now shared authority over national defense. To Saddam Hussein, this looked like weakness. But the roots of the conflict run much deeper than the revolution. For decades, Iran and Iraq have competed for dominance along the Persian Gulf. At the center of their rivalry lies the Shatt al-Arab, the narrow but vital waterway formed where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet before flowing into the sea. Control of this channel means control over shipping lanes, oil exports, and strategic influence across the Gulf. In 1975, after years of tension and border skirmishes, Iraq was forced to sign the Algiers Agreement with Iran. The treaty shifted the boundary and the waterway toward the middle of the river, a humiliating concession Saddam Hussein never truly accepted. Now, with Iran weakened by revolution, he believes the moment has come to rewrite that agreement by force. His strategy is bold and calculated. Iraq's army, nearly 1 million strong with reserves, has been expanded and equipped with modern Soviet tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Military planners expect the Iranian government to collapse quickly under pressure. The war, they predict, will last weeks, not years. Iraqi divisions push across the border in several directions at once. Armored columns roll toward Khorramshahr and Abadan, two cities that sit near the entrance to the Persian Gulf and the heart of Iran's oil industry. Other units move north toward the oil-rich province of Khuzestan, where Saddam believes ethnic Arab populations may rise against Tehran's revolutionary government. In Baghdad, the official narrative spreads rapidly through state media. Iraq, Saddam declares, is not invading. It is reclaiming territory and defending Arab lands from what he calls Persian expansionism. But on the Iranian side of the border, the shock quickly turns into defiance. News of the invasion spreads through mosques, universities, and revolutionary committees across the country. Loudspeakers broadcast urgent messages calling citizens to defend the homeland. Ayatollah Khomeini appears on Iranian radio, delivering a message that will define the war's early phase. He describes the invasion not simply as a territorial dispute, but as a sacred struggle, a defense of Islam itself against foreign aggression. Within days, thousands of volunteers begin flooding recruitment centers. Many are young men barely out of school. Some are teenagers. Others are factory workers, students, or clerics. They join newly formed revolutionary militias known as the Basij, prepared to fight alongside the regular army and the powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Meanwhile, Iraqi forces push deeper into Iranian territory. Khorramshahr becomes one of the first major battlegrounds. Street by street, Iranian soldiers and volunteers resist Iraqi tanks advancing through the port city. Buildings collapse under artillery fire. Snipers fire from shattered rooftops. Smoke covers the skyline as the battle drags on for weeks. The Iraqi leadership expected Iran's defenses to crumble quickly. Instead, they are encountering something else entirely. A population mobilizing for total war. Across Iran, the invasion begins transforming a fractured revolutionary state into a society united by resistance. Factories shift to wartime production. Religious leaders preach sacrifice and endurance. Military commanders scramble to reorganize shattered units and build new defenses. What Saddam Hussein expected to be a swift campaign is already turning into something far more dangerous. And the entire Middle East is watching closely. Because as the war spreads across deserts, oil fields, and river valleys, it will reshape alliances, destabilize economies, and pull global powers into one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the late 20th century. The first explosions along the Iran-Iraq border are only the beginning. In the first weeks of the invasion, Iraqi commanders expect momentum to carry their forces rapidly through Iran's southwestern provinces. Maps spread across military headquarters in Baghdad show arrows pushing deep into Iranian territory, projecting swift victories and the capture of strategic oil cities within days. But the battlefield reality unfolding along the front lines is far more complicated. Iraqi armored divisions cross the border in several sectors, advancing through dusty plains and marshlands towards cities that sit along vital oil pipelines and shipping routes. The Iraqi army is large, well-equipped, and heavily supported by artillery and air power. Soviet-made tanks grind forward behind curtains of shell fire. Yet as Iraqi troops push deeper into Iran, resistance grows stronger. In Khorramshahr, the battle that began as a rapid armored thrust turns into a brutal urban siege. Iranian defenders, many of them poorly equipped volunteers, fight from narrow alleyways, abandoned warehouses, and partially destroyed homes. Iraqi tanks struggle to maneuver through debris-filled streets, while Iranian fighters launch ambushes with rocket-propelled grenades. For nearly a month, the city becomes a battlefield of block-by-block fighting. Smoke hangs constantly over the port. The once busy docks along the Shatt al-Arab fall silent except for the sound of artillery. Oil storage tanks burn in the distance, while civilians flee across bridges carrying whatever belongings they can salvage. Eventually, Iraqi forces capture the city after weeks of grinding combat. But the victory comes at a cost far higher than Iraqi planners expected. And more importantly, the war is already beginning to change character. Saddam Hussein had anticipated a quick collapse of Iranian resistance. Instead, Iran's leadership begins mobilizing the entire nation for a long struggle. Inside Tehran, revolutionary leaders reorganize the country's fractured military command. The regular army, weakened by purges after the 1979 revolution, now begins cooperating with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a powerful parallel military force created to defend the new Islamic Republic. Though tensions remain between the two organizations, the urgency of the invasion forces them into uneasy coordination. Meanwhile, recruitment centers across the country are overwhelmed. Thousands of volunteers arrive every day. Many of them join the Basij, a mass volunteer militia formed under the direction of the Revolutionary Guard. They receive only basic training, sometimes just a few days before being sent toward the front lines. What they lack in equipment, they attempt to replace with ideological commitment. Government propaganda frames the conflict as a sacred defense of the revolution. Posters appear across cities showing martyrs of the war, young men who died defending the nation. Religious sermons emphasize sacrifice, faith, and resistance against foreign aggression. The war becomes deeply intertwined with the identity of the new Iranian state. While Iran mobilizes its population, Iraqi forces struggle to maintain momentum. In several areas, Iraqi armored units outrun their supply lines. Fuel shortages begin appearing along the front. Some Iraqi commanders hesitate to advance too far into unfamiliar territory, where Iranian counterattacks could isolate their divisions. By late autumn 1980, the Iraqi offensive slows dramatically. Front lines begin stabilizing along a wide arc, stretching hundreds of kilometers across the border region. Instead of rapid movement, the war starts transforming into a series of entrenched positions, artillery duels, and limited assaults. The conflict begins to resemble the static battlefields of earlier 20th century wars. But the consequences of this stalemate reach far beyond the battlefield. Across the Middle East, governments watch the war with growing concern. Many Arab states quietly support Iraq, viewing the revolutionary government in Tehran as a dangerous ideological force that could inspire unrest within their own populations. Financial assistance and logistical support begin flowing from wealthy Gulf monarchies toward Baghdad. At the same time, global powers see strategic interests at stake. The Persian Gulf contains some of the largest oil reserves in the world. Any conflict that threatens shipping routes or oil infrastructure immediately attracts international attention. Diplomatic messages move quickly between Washington, Moscow, European capitals, and regional governments. Yet despite growing international concern, neither Iran nor Iraq shows any sign of backing down. Instead, both sides prepare for a longer war. Along the front lines, Iranian commanders begin organizing counteroffensives. Revolutionary Guard units train new waves of volunteers. Military planners study Iraqi defensive positions, searching for weaknesses. In Baghdad, Saddam Hussein also shifts strategy. The quick victory he envisioned has not materialized, but he still believes Iraq holds the advantage. His army remains larger, better equipped, and positioned on territory already captured during the early invasion. For now, he orders Iraqi forces to consolidate their gains. Fortifications appear across newly occupied Iranian land. Trenches are dug, minefields spread across open plains. Artillery batteries establish permanent positions overlooking potential Iranian approach routes. Both sides are digging in. And as winter approaches along the Iran-Iraq border, the early stage of the conflict is ending. What replaces it will be something far more brutal, because Iran is preparing to strike back. By early 1981, the war along the Iran-Iraq border has settled into a tense and unstable stalemate. Iraqi forces remain dug in across large portions of Iranian territory, including key positions near the oil-rich province of Khuzestan. Defensive lines stretch across deserts, marshlands, and river crossings. But inside Iran, the atmosphere is changing. The initial shock of invasion has hardened into determination. Factories that once produced consumer goods are now manufacturing military supplies. Truck convoys move day and night, carrying ammunition, food, and equipment toward the front lines. In cities across the country, recruitment drives continue bringing thousands of new volunteers into the war effort. Iran's leadership has begun preparing for a massive counteroffensive. Military coordination between the regular army and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps improves slowly but steadily. Joint operations are planned to reclaim lost territory and push Iraqi forces back across the border. The strategy relies on numbers, persistence, and the willingness to endure enormous casualties. In September 1981, Iran launches one of its first major counterattacks. The operation begins near the city of Abadan, where Iraqi forces have surrounded the area for nearly a year. Abadan sits on an island formed by the Karon River and the Shatt al-Arab waterway, making it a critical location for Iran's oil industry. For months, the city has been under siege. Food and supplies are limited. Iraqi artillery regularly pounds nearby neighborhoods. Yet Iranian defenders inside the city refuse to surrender. Now, thousands of Iranian troops move into position to break the encirclement. Under cover of darkness, columns of soldiers advance through marshy terrain and irrigation canals surrounding the Iraqi positions. Many of them are Revolutionary Guard fighters and Basij volunteers carrying rifles, rocket launchers, and little else. The battle erupts before dawn. Iranian units attack Iraqi defensive lines in multiple directions. Infantry charge across open ground, while artillery batteries fire from concealed positions behind them. Iraqi commanders respond quickly, bringing tanks and machine guns to bear on advancing Iranian formations. The fighting is chaotic and intense, but by the end of the operation, Iranian forces manage to break the siege of Abadan. The victory electrifies the country. For the first time since the invasion, Iran has successfully pushed Iraqi forces backward on a major front. Iranian state media broadcasts images of soldiers raising flags over reclaimed positions. Celebrations erupt in cities far from the battlefield. The psychological impact is enormous. Iranian commanders quickly begin planning additional offensives. Throughout 1982, Iran launches a series of large-scale operations aimed at liberating occupied territory. Thousands of fighters move toward Iraqi defensive lines, often advancing across minefields and heavily fortified trenches. The tactics are costly. Many attacks rely on massive waves of infantry charging toward Iraqi positions under intense fire. Casualties mount rapidly, yet the relentless pressure begins wearing down Iraqi defenses. One of the most decisive battles occurs in the spring of 1982 near Khorramshahr. Nearly 2 years after Iraqi forces first captured the city, Iran prepares a massive operation to retake it. More than 70,000 Iranian fighters participate in the offensive. Units cross rivers using makeshift bridges and small boats. Others maneuver through marshland to approach Iraqi positions from unexpected directions. Fighting inside the city is brutal. Buildings already damaged from earlier battles collapse under renewed artillery fire. Streets fill with smoke and debris as Iranian fighters move block by block against entrenched Iraqi units. After weeks of combat, Iraqi defenses finally collapse. On May 24, 1982, Iranian forces retake Khorramshahr. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers are captured. Others retreat across the border toward Iraq. Images of jubilant Iranian fighters celebrating the liberation spread rapidly across the country. For Iran, the moment represents a turning point. The original Iraqi invasion has been reversed, but the war itself is far from over. Inside Tehran, a crucial decision now confronts Iran's leadership. Some military officers argue that the primary objective has already been achieved. Iraqi forces have been expelled from most Iranian territory. A ceasefire could end the war with Iran in a position of strength. But Ayatollah Khomeini and other revolutionary leaders reject that option. They believe Saddam Hussein must be removed from power. The war, they declare, will continue until Iraq's government collapses and justice is achieved for the invasion. With that decision, the conflict enters a far more dangerous phase. Iranian forces begin preparing to cross the border into Iraq itself. What began as a defensive war is transforming into an offensive campaign that will drag both nations deeper into destruction. Summer 1982, southern Iraq. Dust blows across a vast network of trenches carved into the dry earth near the border. Iraqi soldiers wait in reinforced bunkers, scanning the horizon through binoculars. For months, they have watched Iranian forces gather across the frontier. Now the war is about to move on to Iraqi soil. After the recapture of Khorramshahr, Iranian leadership faces a historic decision. Their territory has largely been liberated. The original Iraqi invasion has failed, but the political leadership in Tehran does not see the war as finished. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini believes the conflict must continue until Saddam Hussein's government collapses. For the revolutionary leadership, the war has become more than a border dispute. It is framed as a struggle between two political visions of the Middle East, one built around Arab nationalism and authoritarian rule in Baghdad, the other centered on the revolutionary Islamic ideology emerging from Tehran. And so the order is given. Iranian forces begin preparing to carry the war into Iraq. Throughout mid-1982, Iranian troops gather along the frontier in massive numbers. Revolutionary Guard units train new waves of volunteers. Basij fighters arrive by the thousands, many wearing simple headbands symbolizing martyrdom. Across the border, Iraqi commanders brace for what they know is coming. The Iraqi military has learned painful lessons during the early years of the war. Rapid offensive operations proved costly and unsustainable. Now the Iraqi army begins transforming its strategy. Instead of maneuver warfare, they construct layered defensive systems. Trenches stretch for kilometers. Anti-tank ditches cut across open ground. Vast minefields are laid across likely approach routes. Artillery batteries are positioned behind defensive lines, ready to fire on advancing Iranian formations. The landscape begins to resemble the battlefields of the First World War. In July 1982, Iranian forces launch one of their first major attacks inside Iraqi territory. Thousands of Iranian soldiers surge across the border toward the Iraqi city of Basra, Iraq's second-largest city and the economic heart of the country's southern oil industry. The attack begins at night. Iranian infantry advance through marshes and irrigation canals that cut across the flat terrain. Some units manage to slip through Iraqi minefields under cover of darkness. But Iraqi defenses hold. Machine guns open fire across open fields. Artillery shells explode among advancing formations. Iraqi tanks move into position, firing directly at infantry waves, attempting to break through the trenches. The battlefield becomes a scene of chaos. Iranian commanders push more forces forward, hoping sheer numbers can overwhelm Iraqi positions. Some Basij volunteers run across minefields to clear paths for following units, a tactic that becomes tragically common during the war. Despite extraordinary determination, Iranian attacks fail to break Iraqi defenses near Basra. The battle leaves thousands dead on both sides, and it reveals something critical about the next phase of the war. Neither side can easily defeat the other. For Iraq, the defensive strategy proves effective. Saddam Hussein begins investing heavily in fortified lines across the southern front. Engineers expand trench systems and defensive barriers, creating some of the most heavily fortified positions in modern warfare. Meanwhile, Iran refuses to abandon its offensive strategy. Iranian commanders believe that persistence will eventually crack Iraqi defenses. They plan larger operations involving tens of thousands of troops, often launched in successive waves across the same battlefield. As months turn into years, the front lines barely move. Instead, both countries begin pouring enormous resources into sustaining the war. Oil revenues fund weapons purchases. Military industries expand production. Entire generations of young men are sent toward the front lines. The human cost grows staggering. Families across Iran mourn sons who never return from the battlefield. Iraqi cities hold funerals for soldiers killed defending the southern front. Hospitals near the war zone fill with wounded fighters suffering from artillery shrapnel burns and blast injuries. Yet, despite the losses, neither government shows any sign of compromise. Instead, the conflict grows wider. Diplomatic tensions across the Middle East intensify. Arab monarchies continue financially supporting Iraq, fearing that Iran's revolutionary ideology could spread across the region. Iran accuses neighboring governments of backing aggression against the Islamic Republic. The war is no longer just about territory. It is becoming a regional struggle for influence and survival. And soon it will spread beyond land battles along the border. Because both sides are about to discover a new battlefield in the waters of the Persian Gulf. February 1984. Tehran, Iran. Night falls over the Iranian capital as millions of residents move through narrow streets toward their homes. Shops close early, lights dim across entire neighborhoods. Air raid sirens stand ready on rooftops and government buildings. Then the warning sounds. A distant explosion echoes across the city. Moments later, another blast shakes the ground as an Iraqi missile slams into a residential district. Windows shatter. Fires erupt in apartment buildings. Ambulances race through the streets while rescue workers search through debris for survivors. For the first time since the conflict began, the war has reached deep into the civilian heart of both nations. By 1984, the battlefield stalemate along the Iran-Iraq border has forced both governments to search for new ways to pressure their enemy. The result is a brutal escalation known as the War of the Cities. Instead of fighting only along trenches and battlefields, both sides begin launching missile and air attacks directly against major urban centers. The goal is psychological as much as military. Leaders hope that by terrorizing civilian populations, they can weaken the enemy's will to continue the war. Iraq initiates the campaign. Using Soviet-supplied aircraft and ballistic missiles, Iraqi forces begin striking Iranian cities, including Tehran, Isfahan, Tabriz, and Shiraz. Factories, residential districts, and transportation hubs become targets. The attacks are sudden and terrifying. Missiles often arrive with little warning. Buildings collapse under explosive blasts. Families shelter in basements and underground tunnels, while emergency crews search through shattered neighborhoods. Iran quickly responds with its own retaliation. Although Iran's missile capabilities are initially limited, the government begins launching strikes against Iraqi cities, including Baghdad, Basra, and Kirkuk. Iranian aircraft carry out bombing missions against urban infrastructure, while artillery units shell border towns. Soon, millions of civilians across both countries live under constant fear of air raid sirens. Schools close temporarily. Families sleep in underground shelters. In many cities, sandbags line the entrances of hospitals and government buildings. The war is no longer confined to distant battlefields. It has entered everyday life. Yet even as cities come under attack, another dimension of the conflict is emerging hundreds of kilometers to the south. In the waters of the Persian Gulf, by the mid-1980s, both Iran and Iraq recognized that oil exports are the lifeline of their economies. The revenue from oil sales funds weapons purchases, military salaries, and the enormous cost of sustaining the war. Disrupting that flow could cripple the enemy's ability to fight. And so the conflict expands into what becomes known as the tanker war. Iraqi aircraft begin targeting Iranian oil terminals and tankers traveling through the Gulf. Missiles strike shipping lanes used to transport crude oil toward international markets. Several tankers explode into flames, sending columns of black smoke rising above the sea. Iran retaliates by targeting ships connected to Iraq and its regional supporters. Some vessels are attacked with missiles. Others strike naval mines laid secretly along shipping routes. Insurance rates for commercial shipping skyrocket as the Gulf becomes one of the most dangerous waterways in the world. The attacks threaten not only Iran and Iraq, but also the global economy. Nearly a third of the world's oil supply moves through the narrow Strait of Hormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf. Any disruption to this corridor could send shockwaves through global energy markets. International concern grows rapidly. Governments in Washington, Moscow, London, and other major capitals begin monitoring the situation closely. Naval forces from several countries increase their presence in nearby waters to protect commercial shipping. The Iran-Iraq war is now affecting the entire world. Meanwhile, on land, the battlefield stalemate continues. Iran launches repeated offensives aimed at breaking through Iraqi defenses near Basra. Thousands of soldiers cross marshlands and fortified trenches in operations involving enormous manpower. Some attacks gain temporary ground, but Iraqi defensive lines hold. Iraq, backed by financial support from wealthy Gulf states and increasingly supplied with advanced weapons, continues strengthening its fortifications. The war grinds on year after year. Casualties climb into the hundreds of thousands. Entire regions along the border are reduced to devastated landscapes of trenches, destroyed villages, and abandoned farmland. And yet the leadership in both countries refuses to accept defeat. Instead, the conflict is about to enter its darkest and most controversial phase. Because new weapons are about to appear on the battlefield. Weapons that will permanently stain the legacy of the war. March 1984. Southern front near the marshlands east of Basra. A dense morning fog drifts across the battlefield where Iranian troops have spent the night preparing for another assault on Iraqi defensive lines. Trenches cut across the muddy terrain. Soldiers adjust their equipment while commanders study maps under dim lantern light. At first, the attack unfolds like many before it. Iranian infantry move forward through minefields and narrow passages carved into the marshland. Artillery explodes overhead as Iraqi batteries begin firing at the advancing formations. Then something unusual begins to happen. A strange cloud rolls slowly across the battlefield, drifting low along the ground. Some soldiers notice a sharp, unfamiliar smell in the air. Others feel burning sensations in their eyes and lungs. Within minutes, men begin collapsing. Some struggle to breathe. Others claw at their faces as their vision fades. Medics rush forward, only to find themselves overcome by the same invisible force. What the Iranian troops are encountering is not conventional artillery smoke. It is chemical gas. By the mid-1980s, the Iran-Iraq war has reached a level of desperation that pushes the conflict into one of the darkest chapters of modern warfare. Facing relentless Iranian offensives that rely on overwhelming numbers of infantry, Iraqi military leadership begins deploying chemical weapons on the battlefield. These include mustard gas and nerve agents capable of causing devastating injuries even in small concentrations. The effects are horrifying. Mustard gas burns skin and lungs, leaving victims blinded and struggling to breathe. Nerve agents disrupt the body's nervous system, causing paralysis and death within minutes if exposure is severe. Iranian soldiers often have little protection against such attacks. Many units lack proper gas masks or protective suits. Medical teams scramble to treat casualties using improvised methods, while hospitals far behind the front lines begin receiving waves of injured fighters suffering from chemical exposure. Despite the suffering, Iranian forces continue launching offensives. Some soldiers fight while wearing simple cloth masks soaked in water or vinegar in desperate attempts to filter the contaminated air. Others advance through areas still affected by gas in order to maintain pressure on Iraqi defensive lines. Reports of chemical weapon use quickly spread beyond the battlefield. International journalists and humanitarian organizations begin documenting the injuries suffered by Iranian soldiers and civilians. Photographs show victims with blistered skin, swollen eyes, and severe respiratory damage. Global outrage grows. Chemical weapons have been banned by international agreements since the early 20th century, following the horrors of the First World War. Their reappearance on the battlefields of the Iran-Iraq War shocks many observers, yet the international response remains cautious. Several governments fear that openly condemning Iraq could destabilize the balance of power in the region or strengthen Iran's revolutionary government. As a result, diplomatic reactions remain limited while the war continues. The use of chemical weapons soon expands beyond the battlefield. In some areas, near the front lines, entire villages are exposed to gas attacks. Civilians fleeing combat zones unknowingly move through contaminated fields and roads. Medical facilities struggle to treat both soldiers and civilians suffering from chemical burns and lung damage. One of the most tragic incidents occurs later in the war when chemical weapons are used against a Kurdish town in northern Iraq. The attack kills thousands of civilians in a single day and becomes one of the most infamous moments of the conflict. Meanwhile, the broader war continues, grinding forward. Iran launches new offensives across the southern front, hoping to finally break through Iraqi defenses and reach Basra. Iraqi forces respond with overwhelming firepower, fortified positions, and increasingly frequent chemical attacks. The battlefield becomes a terrifying combination of trench warfare, artillery, bombardment, and chemical contamination. Both nations are now deeply trapped in a conflict neither side can easily escape. Economic pressure grows steadily. Oil infrastructure has been damaged repeatedly by missile strikes and naval attacks. Military spending consumes national budgets. Cities across both countries continue suffering missile bombardments during the ongoing war of the cities. After nearly 6 years of fighting, exhaustion begins spreading across both societies. But the war is not yet finished. Instead, it is about to draw the attention of another powerful actor that has been watching the conflict closely from the waters of the Persian Gulf. The United States. July 24, 1987, Persian Gulf near the Strait of Hormuz. The gray hull of a United States Navy warship cuts slowly through the warm waters of the Gulf as helicopters circle overhead, scanning the horizon. Around it, a convoy of oil tankers moves cautiously through one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. This is no ordinary shipping escort. For the first time since the Iran-Iraq War began, American naval forces are directly protecting commercial vessels in the Persian Gulf. By the late 1980s, the tanker war has reached dangerous levels. Iranian and Iraqi attacks on oil tankers have damaged or destroyed dozens of ships moving through the Gulf. Mines float silently beneath the water's surface. Missiles launched from aircraft and coastal batteries threaten any vessel suspected of carrying oil for the opposing side. Insurance companies begin refusing to cover ships entering the region. Global oil markets grow increasingly nervous. The small but oil-rich nation of Kuwait finds itself in a particularly vulnerable position. Although Kuwait is not directly fighting in the war, its financial support for Iraq has made its tankers targets for Iranian attacks. Facing growing danger, Kuwaiti leaders make an extraordinary request. They ask the United States to protect their shipping. Washington agrees. Under a plan known as Operation Earnest, several Kuwaiti oil tankers are reflagged as American vessels, placing them under the protection of the United States Navy. Warships begin escorting convoys through the narrow waters of the Gulf, particularly near the Strait of Hormuz, where nearly all regional oil exports must pass. The presence of American forces dramatically raises the stakes of the conflict. Iranian commanders now face the possibility that attacks on shipping could trigger direct clashes with a global superpower. And soon those clashes begin. Throughout 1987 and 1988, several incidents bring American and Iranian forces into open confrontation. U.S. warships strike Iranian naval units involved in mine-laying operations. Iranian speedboats attempt to harass convoys moving through the Gulf. The tension builds steadily. Then, in April 1988, one of the most intense naval battles of the war erupts. After an American warship strikes an Iranian naval mine and suffers heavy damage, the United States launches a major retaliatory operation against Iranian naval assets. Warships and aircraft attack Iranian oil platforms believed to be used for military coordination. Several Iranian naval vessels are destroyed in a series of fierce engagements across the Gulf. The clash sends a powerful message. The United States is now willing to use military force to secure the shipping lanes of the Persian Gulf. For Iran, already exhausted by years of war, the situation becomes increasingly difficult. On land, Iraqi forces have begun regaining momentum as well. Backed by financial support from Gulf states and equipped with increasingly advanced weapons, Iraq launches several successful offensives that push Iranian forces back from key positions along the southern front. Years of relentless Iranian attacks have taken a heavy toll. Iran's economy is under severe strain. Casualties have reached staggering levels. Entire communities have lost large numbers of young men to the war. Inside Tehran, the leadership begins confronting a painful reality. The war that was meant to overthrow Saddam Hussein and reshape the region is instead draining Iran's resources and weakening the country's future. At the same time, Iraqi missile attacks against Iranian cities intensify once again. The War of the Cities enters another brutal phase as both sides bombard each other's population centers with increasing frequency. In Tehran, families once again move into underground shelters as sirens echo through the capital. After nearly 8 years of conflict, the war has reached a breaking point. International diplomats begin intensifying efforts to negotiate a ceasefire. The United Nations proposes a resolution calling for an immediate end to hostilities and a return to internationally recognized borders. For years, both Iran and Iraq rejected such proposals, but now the pressure is becoming impossible to ignore, and the end of the war may finally be approaching. March 1988, Tehran, Iran. Inside a dimly lit government chamber, senior Iranian leaders gather around a long wooden table. Maps of the southern front cover the walls. Reports from the battlefield arrive hourly. The mood in the room is heavy with exhaustion. For nearly 8 years, the Islamic Republic has fought a war that reshaped the entire nation. Now the leadership must face a difficult question. How much longer can Iran continue? By early 1988, the balance of the war has begun shifting once again. Iraqi forces, strengthened by years of international financial support and modern weapon imports, are launching powerful counter-offensives across the southern front. The most significant battles unfold around the Four Peninsula. This narrow strip of land near the mouth of the Shatt al-Arab waterway had been captured by Iran in 1986 during a surprise amphibious assault. The victory gave Iran a strategic foothold near Iraq's vital shipping lanes and represented one of Tehran's most important military achievements of the war. But now Iraq is determined to take it back. In April 1988, Iraqi forces launch a massive assault on the peninsula. The attack begins with overwhelming artillery bombardment, followed by armored units advancing behind thick smoke screens. Chemical weapons are once again used to break Iranian defensive lines. Within hours, Iraqi divisions pushed through Iranian positions that had taken years to establish. Iranian units retreat across the narrow waterways that connect the peninsula to the mainland. The fall of the Four Peninsula shocks Iranian commanders. It reveals that Iraq's military has become far more capable after years of adaptation and modernization. Iraqi forces continue launching additional operations along the front, retaking other territories Iran had captured earlier in the war. Iran's offensive momentum is collapsing. At the same time, the country's economic situation grows increasingly desperate. Oil facilities have been repeatedly damaged by airstrikes and tanker attacks. Inflation rises sharply. Infrastructure strained by years of war struggles to support the population. Casualties are staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Iranian soldiers have been killed or wounded since the conflict began. Entire towns are marked by rows of graves honoring young men who died along distant battlefields. War weariness spreads quietly through Iranian society. Although public demonstrations of opposition remain rare, the emotional and economic cost of the conflict is becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, diplomatic pressure intensifies. The United Nations has been pushing for a ceasefire under Resolution 598. A proposal that calls for both countries to halt military operations and begin negotiations to end the conflict. For years, Iran rejected the resolution, believing continued fighting could eventually topple Saddam Hussein's government. But by mid-1988, the situation has changed dramatically. Iraq's military resurgence, combined with American naval pressure in the Persian Gulf, has placed Iran in a far more vulnerable position. Then a tragic incident further raises the stakes. On July 3, 1988, a civilian passenger aircraft traveling over the Persian Gulf is mistakenly shot down by a United States Navy warship during a period of heightened military tension. All passengers and crew aboard the aircraft are killed. The disaster shocks the international community and adds enormous pressure to the already fragile situation surrounding the war. Inside Iran's leadership circles, the realization begins spreading that the conflict cannot continue indefinitely. Ayatollah Khomeini faces one of the most difficult decisions of his leadership. Accepting a ceasefire would mean ending a war that had been framed for years as a sacred struggle. It would also leave Saddam Hussein still in power in Baghdad. Yet continuing the war could risk even greater losses for the country. Finally, after months of internal debate, the decision is made. Iran will accept the United Nations ceasefire proposal. Khomeini later describes the decision as being like drinking a bitter poison. But it will bring the war closer to its end. August 20th, 1980. 8. Iran-Iraq border. As the sun rises over the scarred landscape of trenches and shattered villages, something unusual spreads along the front lines. Silence. For nearly 8 years, artillery has thundered across these plains. Rockets, mortars, and machine guns have echoed through the desert day and night. Entire towns along the frontier have lived under constant bombardment, but on this morning the guns begin to fall quiet. Under the terms of United Nations Resolution 598, a ceasefire between Iran and Iraq officially takes effect. Military units on both sides receive orders to halt offensive operations and remain in their positions. Along the front lines, so soldiers emerge cautiously from bunkers and trenches. Many stare across the narrow stretches of devastated terrain, separating the two armies. Some enemy positions are only a few hundred meters away. For years, these soldiers have tried to kill each other across these fields. Now they simply watch. The war that consumed nearly a decade of their lives is ending, but the battlefield reveals the enormous price that both countries have paid. The border region has been transformed into a landscape of destruction. Entire villages lie abandoned. Oil facilities stand twisted and burned. Roads disappear into minefields that will remain dangerous for decades. The human toll is even greater. Historians estimate that the war caused more than 1 million casualties combined between Iran and Iraq. Hundreds of thousands were killed. Many more were wounded, permanently disabled, or exposed to chemical weapons whose long-term effects will haunt survivors for years. Families across both countries carry the weight of loss. In Iran, memorials appear in towns and cities honoring the young men who died defending the country during what the government calls the sacred defense. Photographs of fallen soldiers line public buildings and mosques. In Iraq, the government portrays the war as a heroic defense against Iranian aggression. State media highlights military victories and emphasizes the resilience of Iraqi forces against overwhelming odds. But beneath the official narratives, both societies are exhausted. The economies of both countries have been severely damaged. Oil infrastructure has been destroyed or disrupted. Military spending drained national budgets for years, and yet despite the staggering cost, the war ends with borders almost exactly where they were before the conflict began. The Shatt al-Arab waterway remains disputed, but largely unchanged. Neither side achieves the decisive victory their leaders once promised. For many observers, the war stands as one of the most tragic examples of prolonged conflict without clear resolution. Yet its consequences will echo far beyond the ceasefire. Because the war reshaped the political landscape of the Middle East in ways that will influence the region for decades. Iraq emerges from the conflict heavily militarized but financially strained. Saddam Hussein's government owes enormous debts to countries that supported the war effort, particularly Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Those debts will soon become a source of tension. Meanwhile, Iran, despite the devastation, has survived the conflict and consolidated its revolutionary government. The experience of total war strengthens the power of the Revolutionary Guard and deepens the ideological identity of the Islamic Republic. But the story of the Iran-Iraq War does not truly end when the guns fall silent. Its legacy is only beginning. February 1989. Tehran, Iran. Winter snow falls quietly across a cemetery on the outskirts of the city. Rows of identical grave markers stretch across the hillside, each bearing the photograph of a young soldier who never returned from the front. Families walk slowly between the graves. Mothers place flowers beside headstones. Fathers stand silently reading the names carved into stone. Many of the dates show lives that ended in the early 20s. For Iran, the Iran-Iraq War is no longer an active battlefield, but it remains a living memory. The conflict that began in September 1980 reshaped the entire Middle East. It transformed political institutions, military doctrines, and regional alliances in ways that would influence the next generation of conflicts. In Iran, the war becomes a defining chapter in the identity of the Islamic Republic. The government frames the conflict as a heroic defense of the revolution against foreign aggression. Annual commemorations honor those who died during what is officially remembered as the Sacred Defense. The war also strengthens the power of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, OBU. Originally created as a revolutionary security force, the Guard expands dramatically during the conflict. It develops into a powerful military and political institution with influence across Iran's defense industry, intelligence operations, and regional strategy. In many ways, the experience of war solidifies Iran's modern security doctrine. The leadership concludes that the country must never again face such a threat without strong defenses and regional allies. In the years that follow, Iran invests heavily in missile technology, asymmetric warfare capabilities, and networks of allied groups across the Middle East. The lessons of the war shape every major Iranian security decision that follows. In Iraq, the consequences unfold differently. Although Saddam Hussein presents the ceasefire as a victory, the war leaves Iraq economically devastated. The government has borrowed billions of dollars to finance military operations. Infrastructure damage and lost oil revenue strain the national economy. Saddam's government begins demanding that Gulf states forgive Iraq's wartime debts. When those negotiations fail, tensions rise rapidly. Just 2 years after the Iran-Iraq War ends, Saddam Hussein orders Iraqi forces to invade Kuwait in August 1990. The decision triggers an international military coalition led by the United States and begins another major Middle Eastern conflict known as the Gulf War. In that sense, the legacy of the Iran-Iraq War directly shapes the next crisis in the region. The conflict also influences global military thinking. The war demonstrates the devastating potential of prolonged trench warfare, combined with modern artillery missile technology and chemical weapons. It reveals how ideological mobilization can sustain national resistance even under extreme casualties. And it highlights how regional conflicts can gradually draw in global powers when strategic resources like oil and international shipping routes are threatened. Perhaps most importantly, the war leaves a deep psychological mark on both societies. An entire generation in Iran and Iraq grows up during years of air raids, sirens, missile attacks, and battlefield casualties. For many families, the memory of the conflict remains deeply personal, defined by lost relatives and disrupted lives. The scars of the war are still visible decades later. Along the former front lines, unexploded mines remain buried in the soil. Ruined trenches cut across deserts where armies once fought. Memorials stand in cities remembering soldiers who never returned. The war that began with sudden explosions along the border in 1980 ultimately reshaped an entire region. It strengthened governments, destroyed economies, altered alliances, and set the stage for future conflicts that would continue defining Middle Eastern geopolitics. And for those who lived through it, the Iran-Iraq War remains a reminder of how a single political decision can unleash years of devastation. A conflict that began with the belief it would last only weeks, instead consumed nearly a decade and an entire generation. End.